Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this futuristic, very old university. We are 1 hour ahead of time, but we are also 400 years old. My name is Jaap de Wilde. Some of you I saw last week in this series. I'm a professor in international relations at this university, and I have the pleasure to chair this session in the series, which is called The Battle for Resources. Resource wars, scarcities, complexities of the world economy. Should we trust the Russians? Should we trust people from Arabia? Where do we get our oil from? Can we do without? Should they trust us? Well, she's introducing herself already. Coby van der Linde. We couldn't get a better specialist on this field that she will talk about. It's here announced as international developments in oil and gas markets in the face of geopolitical tensions, geopolitics and energy resources, uncertainty, these kind of things she will discuss. I said with some justice that we couldn't imagine a better speaker here, because you're not just one of our leading Dutch specialists in the field and not just one of our European specialists in the field, but global as well. And you're from here as well. She has a chair here in the Energy Academy Europe. Well, yeah, if I give a complete resume, it would take too long. But it's interesting to know that when the first lecture I met you, you were talking about an advisory report you had just written for the European Commission. And the last time I heard you speak was in Berlin at a meeting of the International Gas Union, where she is recruited as a so-called wise person. And this is an organization of all the CEOs of the gas industries in over 100 countries of the world. So we won't steal much of your time by introducing you. We are curious to hear from you how we should evaluate all these troubles related to gas, oil, which are sometimes very nearby with shaking grounds here in Groningen and sometimes shaking world politics. So the floor is yours, and we're curious to hear what you are going to tell us.
Yeah, of course. Thank you very, very much for having me here, because I'm from here. But sometimes I'm not very visible here, so I was really happy when I got the invite. We had to negotiate about the date a little bit. In the end, he stuck to his guns, and so now I have like a 24-hour day today. So because tomorrow morning I have to be back in The Hague, so I couldn't take your offer on staying over in Groningen. But I'm really happy that we get to talk a little bit about oil and gas. I went for the traditional thing. Why? Because you hear so much about renewables. If people do polls, then most of you will write in that poll that you think that 80% of the Dutch energy already comes from that resource, which is really silly, because we are a molecule country and our molecules come from predominantly Groningen. I think we should look at gas markets a little bit, because this is also about yourself. But there's also really interesting stuff going on in oil. And oil and gas are, let me put it this way, Europe is having an energy discussion which is somewhat of an outlier discussion. The rest of the world is talking about this stuff. Yeah? So if we want to talk geopolitics, it's still oil and gas. Perhaps I should have included coal. But that will come as part of the conversation as well. But not so much the type of discussion we have in Europe. Every time I leave Europe, I go to one of these energy conferences, they keep asking me, what's going on in Europe? What are you guys doing? And sometimes I say, well, I wish I knew. Yeah? So I know what our ambitions are, but the way we go about it, yeah? We tend to live in the future too much, that we talk as if it is already 2050, and we study not enough on how to get there in a way that all our consumers can afford the energy. Because once you have energy, you're empowered. You can work, you can produce, you have heat, you can protect yourself. And so it really is very important. It's a basic need, and it's very important to get this one right. So we can't really experiment with it too much. We can experiment some, because we have a lot of knowledge in this country, but we can't really... and sometimes I think if you want in discussion, I'm quite happy to discuss Germany, for instance, what's going on there and what the impact is here. But I think it's good to get a sense of what the rest of the world is talking about. So, risks, you know that. Traditionally, when we look at energy, it's basically brought back to population and economic growth problem. Well, this is already really interesting because we don't really know when we say population growth. If we look at the last 20 years, you can have a population growing, but if they don't have access to commercial energy, then that doesn't really impact your numbers too much. Yeah? So it matters how many people have access to commercial energy. That really tells you a little bit about where demand is going and what type of demand we will have. We do know that most of the energy demand will be not in our world, but will be in Asia. Yeah, I will show you some numbers. It's quite staggering. And we also know that urbanization will probably continue like it's been doing in the past, and that so our energy consumption will also be very much urban energy consumption. Maybe at the countryside we will have different systems. So that's good to know. But I always think that it's a little bit too simple to just make it a demography and economy type of problem. It's a little bit more, because energy is also about social relations, and it's about the relations between states. And that's where it gets interesting, because most of the analysis, for instance, in next week, Tuesday, the World Energy Outlook of the International Energy Agency will be presented in London. And that's just driven, all the numbers that you see there, the scenarios, are driven by these two factors. Yeah? And of course these people know that there's more to it, but by statute, they have to use the numbers of the IMF for economic growth and the UN numbers on the demography. Yeah? So we all know that the IMF always it's a little bit optimistic where it comes to economic growth, so you know, you always have to make your own translation of WEO, what it really means. But the world is full of that sort of stuff. Yeah? So we make scenarios that we use them as if they're the truth. This is exactly how it's going to go. The report you're referring to were the 2050 roadmaps. These were backcasting scenarios. You know what they are? Backcasting. Well, then you put yourself in 2050, you look back and say, okay, that's where we came from. This is how we got there. It's very stylized way of looking at things. If you then present them to policymakers or to politicians who don't know what a backcasting type of scenario is and use them as the truth, this is how we have to get there, so you reverse it again, you can really make great policy accidents. Yeah? So you need to understand what sort of things are being thrown in the discussion. And with energy we have point scenarios, we look for extreme values, and that's how it gets such a mixed up bit that we don't really know what's going on. So that's why it's always good to use a little bit of the past to understand what the trend is. And of course, since we're also going to deal with geopolitics, whatever happened in the past is not really a guarantee that we will stay on trend. Yeah? Because this is based on a world that was opening up, where more international trade, international investment, capital flows were taking place. And I'm not really sure that will be the same case in the next 30 to 40 years. Maybe we'll have less of these flows. Maybe we will become all more inward looking. Yeah? So this is just a projection of the type of models that we have learned from the past, and we project them on the future. What we do see, though, is that economic growth has risen substantially, that the energy intensity of our economies has declined, so we're doing better. We use less energy to produce a unit of GDP. But what we also know is that in the past 10 to 15 years, most of that energy that was growing was not something efficient like gas, but it was coal. It was a coal-driven economic growth. So And that growth came because of China. So if you then look at the world and you see a development where OECD countries have moved from coal to an oil-based economy and then moved on to a much more hybrid coal or nuclear for the steady sources to oil and gas. Yeah? While in developing countries, you can find still quite a lot of coal in the mix, or they begin to import a little bit of gas, but gas is usually the last thing they will begin to import, depending a little bit on what resources they have. Yeah? And of course, that's also depending on what they can do with their balance of payments. Can they afford imported energy or not? And if they can't afford imported energy, they will use the energy they have domestically. It's usually as simple as that. But we do have two different profiles. We have a more or less stagnant, if not declining, energy consumption profile of the OECD countries. So that's North America, Europe, and Australia and Japan. And we have this really fast-growing world out there, particularly in Asia and Middle East and Africa as new consumers. And that translates to the type of growth that we see on that end. If you then look where all the growth is coming from, then China really stands out. And that immediately warns us, because China has had tremendous growth in the past 25 years. And we know already now they're not going to grow the same in the next 25 years. So when you try to project again and think about it, what I always try to do is, some of us will remember, do you remember the hype we had about Japan in the 1980s? About how they were growing and sky was the limit, we were stupid, they were clever. Yeah, and then they came into this stagnation and we never heard of Japan again when it came as an example, yeah, except for bad things. Yeah? Now, when we have deflation, we refer to Japan. So with China, it was all more or less the same. We projected in all our models, we pretended as if China would keep on growing. And of course, the resource base, the people of China, is much larger than Japan's. But they're reaching the limits, maybe not population-wise, but their environment is suffering. Their banking system is somewhat rickety. Yeah? And so fast growth, just like when you study companies and you go for very fast growth, at some point you lose the coherence. Yeah? And then you need to kind of resource yourself, figure out how to go to the next level. And that's what China is now forced to do. They're not growing as fast anymore. And we see that now today in the energy markets with China's demand, who's so dominant for the past decades of growth. When China is hiccuping, oil prices fall. Yeah? It's as simple as that. We had already a little bit of a whiff of it in 2008. Remember Olympics in China? Well, the Chinese government was not going to take any risks. They had all these measures out there for air quality for the sporters. They had stocked up so many oil products. So they'd been driving up the price until July 2008, when they had stocked up so much so that in every eventuality they would have enough. And so they stopped buying because the Olympics started and they knew they were okay. You know, and prices fell off the cliff. Yeah? This was just a month before Lehman Brothers fell. Yeah? We had oil prices already going over the side and falling really from $139 in some markets to something like, I think by the end of December, because then we also had the financial crisis, they were close to $35. And, you know, you have to know the value of the dollar. I mean, not all the dollars are the same. But that was really a steep fall. I mean, there's a 25% we've seen now since June is kind of chicken feed compared to that. Yeah? So, and that was just China, yeah, setting the oil market over the edge by stopping to buy for somewhat of a month. Yeah? All of a sudden, all confidence disappeared from the markets, and of course, Lehman Brothers didn't help either. All of a sudden, you know, demand was gone. So China is really important. And the question, of course, is for energy markets, and when you think in terms of scarcity, if China is going from a middle-income country trying to get to a high-income country and then needs to develop its domestic market more. That will have a different impact on markets. And then they might not have such an export-oriented strategy. If that happens at the same time when India is coming up, then markets would be able to continue to grow. But the question is whether the new Prime Minister in India can actually pick up where China left off. And if there is a mismatch in timing, then we see markets collapse. Because we've been oversizing capacities. Look at the number of mines we have in Australia based on this sort of projection that China would eat up all the coal they could dig up. And so we are in a period where we've overinvested in quite a lot of the energy. So when I was invited to do resource wars and whatever, then you have to tell me which time frame I have to think in. Because for the next couple of years, I don't think scarcity is really a problem. The only scarcity that I see around is in carbon space. Yeah? Is the ability to emit CO2. That's getting scarcer and scarcer. Yeah? But when it comes to energy, I'll show you the reserve base. I'm not really so sure. We've invested heavily in all these capacities, so we'll see. If we then look at where the hotspot, oh, that's not a very clear. Can you actually see who's what? Well, basically, it looked much better on my computer screen. See, I should ask my younger ones to make these slides. I mean, I think I'm really being very clever, but it's just the time. Okay, so all the blocks are all these narrow straits where we have more and more trade flows going through, assuming that we will continue with this globalization model. I'm not really sure yet. And then we have, if you look at Europe, there's a lot of dots in the neighborhood of Europe, basically. That was the main message. Yeah? So we have the Ukraine with both, we have both transportation choke points, but also political instability. We have the Middle East, North Africa, which is really interesting because when we talk about our energy problems in Europe, we're only talking about the Ukraine or about Russia, right? How much are we talking about the impact on Italian security of supply, of the political unrest in North Africa? If I'm sure that if the Prime Minister of Italy wants attention for that, then no one in Brussels will really listen. I mean, they've sorted out Libya, so that's the end of it. Great. So if you look at Europe, there is issues with security of supply. And this whole talk about diversification is getting somewhat complicated because where to diversify to? If we pick fights with everyone around us, then we're in a spot of trouble. And I will show you where our energy is coming from, and then maybe this map is beginning to make a little bit more sense. But to give you one example, do you know how Qatari LNG, as our savior perhaps, how that gets to Europe? Which route? Yeah, it comes through the Strait of Hormuz, together with all that oil going to China. Yeah, then goes through the Bab al-Mandab, where also these oil tankers are still around because they need to feed into the Sudamed pipeline. Goes through the Suez Canal, and of course an LNG tanker, that means that you have to clear the canal. Yeah, so that's a floating pipeline where you have to clear the canal of all the other shipping going on. Going through the Mediterranean, where you have to navigate between all sorts of problems. And then it goes to the terminals in France, Italy, and the Netherlands. We have one too. And the UK. So some of these problems, when we say, oh, we should import more LNG, yeah, because that will solve all our problems, then I think, where are these people coming from? Yeah? We're just adding to them because they're the same type of problems we have that when we do an analysis on oil, we say, oh, we have all these choke points on our transportation routes, and we should worry about that. Yeah? But when we talk about gas and it's LNG, they come through the same route. All of a sudden, these problems seem to have disappeared because you don't see them in the reports anymore. Yeah?
But isn't the idea of liquid natural gas
Okay, he says, isn't LNG an alternative to Russian gas? Yeah, but it depends what type of problem you want to. What's wrong with Russian gas?
Well, the thing is you want to diversify so that Russia has less power over Europe.
Okay, so then your main problem is Russia, and then the new problems you take on board are just part of, you know.
Yeah, but then you have two different resources. So
Yeah,
and they will both shut.
Well, then I have very bad news for you, because the Middle East is not really very peaceful at the moment. And it's never been, by the way, because we keep meddling in there, so the likelihood of that getting okay. I mean, then you have to live with the fact that the Suez Canal is a lot more reliable now that Mr. Sisi has taken over again. Yeah? I mean, that was a great victory for the Arab Spring. Yeah? I mean, we're very moral about a lot of the relationships we have. Yeah? So, yes, you are right. You diversify and therefore you spread your risk, but you take on board new risk. That's what I'm trying to say. It's not as if we move from Russia to Turkmenistan that all of a sudden our problems will have disappeared, or that the human rights issues we have are all of a sudden not there, because there's different issues there. And whichever country we import from, there will be issues. Yeah? And maybe the conclusion is that it's sometimes very difficult to compare some of these dossiers of foreign policy we have with all the other ones. Yeah? But anyway, just gives you a sense. Another conclusion I take from this map is that the United States, there's the green dot with Venezuela, and the Panama Canal will be widened by the Chinese and opening soon if they figure out how to release them from the financial troubles. But North America is a different story now. If you look at how the slowdown in China is already felt, then we see that it will translate, and that's good news, also in the slowdown of coal. So that because their growth was coal-driven, a slowdown in growth would also translate in less coal. They still consume half the world's coal. That's a lot of coal. Yeah? If you then look at the evolution of our energy systems, then it has become a lot more diversified. Yeah? New energy technologies have been coming into our mix on a continuous basis, but it's slow before it has an impact on worldwide energy systems. So even though one country can be really far ahead, if you just think about how quickly France went from an oil-based country to a nuclear-based country, they did that in the space of 10 to 15 years, and it was done. Yeah? And if you think about it, maybe Germany will be a wind and solar country in the same space of time. Yeah? If you put your mind to it, and you have good reasons, and you have the support of your population to do so, you can actually change your energy economy fairly quickly. The tricky point is that if everyone else would do the same, then you have a problem. Yeah? So technology and economy-wise, these transitions need to take time because you need to balance it out. The flexibility of one technology over the other is not the same, so you need to even it out. But it shows that over a period of 40 years, you can change dramatically. And that's exactly the time until 2050 where Europe wants to make this transformation. So it's not totally nonsense, right? So it can be done, these quick changes.
Can you explain the colors, what we see?
Oh, you can't see them. It's biomass, traditional biomass. So that was something before the Industrial Revolution. We had traditional biomass. Then coal came in for the Industrial Revolution very quickly, first in the UK. And as it spread out to other countries, it removed traditional biomass. But obviously, in some economies, traditional biomass is still prevalent in Africa, for instance. So yellow is the coal, and then came the oil revolution. It started out as an international industry in Russia and in North America, but expanded most in North America, and then came to Europe after the Second World War. And so it had tremendous growth. Also, Japan got an oil economy. And then gas came into the mix. Yeah? In the Netherlands, a little bit earlier, because we found the Slochteren field in the late 1950s. And the Dutch economy was converted from a coal-based very quickly to an oil-based to a gas-based economy. Yeah, that was done also in 10 years. And I'm old enough to remember that they took the coal heater out. So these transitions take place, but here you have the feeling, okay, if you look at the renewables, something will happen. And of course what you see is that because it's you present it as a share, it looks as if the shares work out well. But if you look at the total volumes, then it's really still very small. Yeah? So the hydro, the nuclear, and we might have the feeling that nuclear is a very big industry, but if you look at the contribution to world consumption, that's not very much. Yeah? And if you think in terms of the transition we want to engage in now, and you would want to do that on a world scale, that's an awful lot of energy you need to replace. So the conclusion is that's probably not going the way it's going to happen. Yeah? Something else will. There's other solutions out there that might help you to achieve your goals. And usually we say that transition is successful when a fuel has achieved 30% of a country's energy mix. Yeah? What Europe is talking about is 80 to 90%. Yeah? So that's a different... I'm going to move ahead a little bit. Okay. I want to go to this one. This is the IEA's projection of proven and reserves, which is the dark part, and the resources that theoretically are there. Yeah? Because there is the definition of what a reserve is very strict, depending, for instance, if you have a listed company in the US, it has to be according to the rules of the market, that you have taken an investment decision on the reserves before you can count it. It's different for oil and gas. So something that we just know that is there because of basins, that's what we call a resource. Yeah? And a lot of the resources will never make it into reserves. Just never. They're in the wrong place, too far away from a market, so the infrastructure might be too expensive, might be on the wrong person's land, and when they say no, it's no. So that will never make it into the darker spots. So a lot of the resources, and this goes for all natural resources, they might be technically there or theoretically there, but they're not economically or socially there or politically there. Yeah? So there's a big difference. And it's the social economic construct that brings it into the proven bracket so that you begin to do something with it. And even then it can change. An example. In the 1970s, the world's rare earth materials industry was based in California, USA. They were the largest producer. Rare earth, on average, is a byproduct of other mining. And so they had a lot of mines there, and they produced the rare earth. They introduced environmental legislation, and it made the rare earth way too expensive to produce in California. Mines closed, end of story. No more rare earth industry, and therefore the resource that they had became an unresource, yeah? A previous resource. Didn't exist, couldn't be harvested anymore. Then China was a big miner already, having a large mining industry, and so they began to purchase the rare earth there, until China decided they wanted to build its own value chain on these products and began to restrict trade. But by then, demand, because of our new technologies, phones, computers, and wind and solar energy, had created so much more demand for this. Yeah, there used to be tiny, tiny markets, these new markets for this rare earth, that the price had gone up so much that even with strict legislation in the US, but also in Australia, new rare earth production was set up when they couldn't access in China. So all of a sudden, the resources of California became reserves again. And before, we didn't count them anymore because it was over. Yeah? So it's much more dynamic, is what I'm trying to say. Yeah? So don't believe all these. Yes, in physics terms, it is fixed. But in terms of investments and social relations, it's a lot more dynamic. Yeah? Industries disappear. They leave countries, never to return again. Because it's finished? No. It's just because the circumstances are not there to risk the capital, to risk the people, and to bring it above the ground. Yeah? So we have to remember that. Energy is much more of a socio-economic construct. Okay, we're going to quickly go to oil. Okay, you very quickly saw that most of the reserves by 2008 were in OPEC countries, yeah? I don't need a slide for that, you know that. 75% of known oil reserves were in OPEC countries, yeah? After the shale revolution, the dispersion of reserves expanded tremendously. And basically, the geopolitics of OPEC changed because scarcity of possibilities of beginning to harvest oil and gas reserves changed. If you have this sort of potential, I'm not saying that they will ever be produced in some of the countries, but it's not so concentrated in the Middle East. Yeah? So geopolitically, a lot changed. By the way, the largest basin for shale is located in Russia. It's the Bazanov Shale. So whether we like it or not, Russia is going to be part of the energy world for a long time to come. Whether we like it or not, I think in 5-10 years' time, Russia will still be a neighboring country of the EU. Yeah? For me, that kind of says something about what sort of strategy I want. I want to solve things, yeah, so that some of the risks, yeah, I don't have anything against Russian gas, for instance. They're molecules, just like molecules that come from other countries. I have something against I don't like to be being pushed in a certain corner. I mean, by no one, yeah. I like to make my own decisions. So that I understand from the EU. But if we phrase things that we will never come back, yeah, the absolute terms that we discuss our problems we have with Russia, I think is a bit over the top. So our strategy should be to force the Russians at the table and work something out, right? That's safer, I think, than picking fights and saying, I don't ever want to see you again, yeah? Which is the way we are discussing things now. I think that an isolated Russia is actually much more scary than an integrated Russia. Why? Because I'm old, and because I'm old, I remember I've been taught, it's been hammered into my head that European peace and security is based on the interconnection between our economies. And for the past 3 years, what do I hear when I go to Brussels? We want to be totally self-sufficient in energy, solar and wind, duh. And nuclear, I guess. Brussels, they always want nuclear at some point. And therefore not trade with countries around us or the rest of the world. So we're talking isolationist type of strategies. We laughed at George Bush when he said it. Yeah? Of course, if you look at the situation of the US now, we shouldn't have laughed because he probably had no hand in it whatsoever because the American policy towards energy is somewhat liberal as in non-existent. Yeah? But they are independent. Yeah?
What was the reason for glasnost?
For glasnost? I think it had a lot to do with the internal crisis in Russia and trying to reform the internal institutions. And just like with Obama, we like Gorbachev more and his reforms than the local population.
Was it a coincidence that oil prices dropped by over half in the period before?
In 1986.
No, maybe end of the around the 80s.
Glasnost was 1988.
Can Read the question
Oh,
because
sorry.
not everyone can hear it.
Was glasnost a coincidence? No, the Russian oil crisis was actually, it's a really interesting phenomenon. And there's a great book by, I forgot his name now, it's published in Princeton by this guy. He now works for Dan Jurgen in IHS, Sarah. Where the way the prices worked in Eastern Bloc was that there was a delay, almost like gas prices that are attached to oil prices, and then 6 months later, the Dutch found out in '73 we were rich, right? It worked the reverse way in Russia. So when in '85, '86 prices collapsed for no reason, I don't think it had anything. It had much more to do with the Plaza Agreement and the rejigging of the dollar, yeah, and the change in monetary policy of the U.S. than it had to do with energy prices. But it created that energy became very expensive in Russia and the Eastern Bloc, while it became really cheap in the West. And so they had difficulty with their trade, which was all planned. Of course, planning imports and exports is really difficult because you can plan your exports, but if all of a sudden you have to export 3 times as much, you might not have the capacity. If the value has, if you're aiming for $100,000 and you now need to sell 3 million barrels rather than 1, then you have a problem if you don't have the pipelines for that. Yeah? So they had difficulty, and because they didn't collect as much foreign currency, they couldn't buy as many imports, and therefore couldn't renew their own industry. That was, and if you do that for a number of years. So it was much more, I think, an internal problem, so much as I don't believe in these theories that they did try to make the dollar decline in a managed way, which failed badly in the Plaza and Louvre agreement. But that was more the cause of it than aiming for oil.
Thank you for pointing this out. You mentioned that energy is a socio-economic construct.
Yeah, just a second. This
Now we need a microphone. Now we're going to have a discussion.
This seems to be interesting,
Great.
so please let us share.
Yeah, I'm not wedded to my slides, so I can pull them up whenever I think they're relevant to your question, so please.
Let's take it after your presentation. I think much more will become clear, and then we have more time to actually listen to the story. So let me give back the microphone.
Okay.
That's
No,
good.
I thought we were going to have a nice dogfight about dollars and oil.
We have a cliffhanger for after your presentation. So.
Now you have to come back, though. Yeah? So shale, the shale revolution, the technology of shale is changing the world. Sometimes here in Europe, when we discuss shale, we feel very uncertain about it. We see what it's done to the US. I can show you a little bit on how production has increased. It's really staggering how it has helped us in the last couple of years not to have an oil crisis. When Libya was in total disarray, or Iraq didn't produce, or Nigeria lost its oil left, right, and center. But what we don't realize is that this technology is very young. This technology is, the productivity gains that you see in shale are really staggering. The footprint is getting smaller. And so at some point it will land on our desks again, and we will have to look at it in all honesty. And we know that the early days of shale in the US will never happen here, just because it's 20 years later, right? We are supposed to learn, and the technology evolves. But it's not going to go away. China will do its shale. Russia, okay, now they have to delay their plans because the shale developments which they were going to do from next year onwards are falling under the sanctions, so they might have to delay that a little bit. But there's a lot of interest. And if that stuff gets developed, then the concentration of oil reserves is going to be much less. Yeah? So you have more suppliers. Economists like that. Yeah? More suppliers, more choice, and hopefully more open markets, yeah? Rather than just for your friends. Okay, this was just a pass now. I will give my slides later to the organization, so then you can ask if you want to have a look at them. You can always get the PDF. If you then look at the companies, because I included this because the last 3-4 days, the third quarter results from Shell and Exxon and all these other companies came in, and what did you notice? Integrated companies, the ones who have upstream, but also refineries and petrochemical plants, they had really good profits. So what they couldn't make in the upstream after June, they did all right in the downstream. Yeah? Before it was the other way around, when crude oil prices were high. But companies that were less integrated, who had totally focused on upstream developments, they really suffered, BP among them. Yeah? And so for the last couple of years, when we have discussions, it's about access. Where do they have access to make their investments, to try out their technologies? There's not that many countries. Yeah? So it's only in Canada, a little bit in the United Arab Emirates. Venezuela was open, but then it's closed again. Russia was opening up. Finally, last year, Putin opened up his oil sector for the offshore, the shale, and for LNG. And we slammed the door shut again. We've been begging for these guys for like 10 to 15 years to open up. Brazil is partly open, and Norway is partly open, because the state company also wants a piece of the pie. So no wonder you get concentration from when it comes to investments by large companies on certain types of oil developments. And they are the ones that we hear about a lot. But just as a reminder how important Russia is, I thought it would be nice to show you that Russia is one of the top oil producers, second exporter. So they're really out there. I mean, they're not small. And this is oil, right? Because we've been talking until we saw blue in the face about Russian gas. But these guys are pretty important when it comes to oil. Yeah? I think oil is more important to Putin than gas. So what we see in terms of investments is that a lot of technical oil is being brought to the market. Yeah? Technical oil in deep offshore, tar sands, shale, the Arctic. Very expensive type of oil, because the cheap oil is not available for private companies. That's all in the realm of the state companies. So we have a segregation in the market, which oil can be brought to the market. And of course we know that if the oil price is 125, you can actually do all this stuff. Maybe not the most far out Arctic, that's for past 2025, but most of this stuff you can bring to the market. Now the price is $80. Yeah? So now it becomes really hairy, because what we've seen over the last couple of decades is that costs have risen quite a lot in order to access this new type of oil. And so now we have a lot of marginal barrels in the hands of private companies. This was also the case in 2008, when the price fell to $35. Then OPEC began to stabilize the price, and they ended up something like, what was it again? $70. Ooh, that was the price of Canadian tar sands. Yeah? So they didn't have to close down the projects. Ooh, that was a real coincidence, right? That was the IOCs and the NOCs who could live with that price. It taught us a lesson, perhaps, where we will end up this time. If you look at the American increases, it's like, it was amazing. It's such a fast rise of production. Yeah? It's really amazing, and year after year. That was because oil prices were really high, and I think maybe it will not be as fast. And this is the wet stuff, right? This is not shale gas. We all think that shale is gas. This is shale oil, or tight oil, as we call it. Most of the gas produced in the US is a byproduct of this stuff. Yeah? These are the sweet spots. Why? Because oil prices are much higher than gas prices in the US and in the international market. Yeah? They're going after shale for oil. Yeah? First for gas, And when gas prices collapsed, they went for the oil. Yeah? And the oil created all this stuff. It really helped when we had all these geopolitical problems and all these disruptions in supply in the Middle East or in Africa, that the United States was producing so much more. So they were not importing from world markets, and therefore the Europeans, also helped by a very healthy value of the euro towards the dollar, we didn't feel anything. We didn't even notice there was a crisis in Libya, or that the Iraqis didn't produce according to what they had planned, or I don't know. We had all sorts of disruption, I think. Yeah. We even managed to sanction Iran, also a fairly large player. We said, well, you know. We've had times where we don't pick fights with these guys. When we have tight markets, we're not so liberal with throwing out sanctions. But in a market where we feel confident there is enough supply, sanctions are easier. Yeah? So Iran was banned off the market. So that was a lot of oil to lose. Yeah? Again, in 2007, the difference between a price hike on the market was about 200,000 barrels a day. And we lost 3 million in this period. And it was all made up by the US. Okay, another issue. I get a lot of phone calls from journalists sounding really serious and worried about IS, or ISIS, as I would like to call them, because if you call them IS, then you recognize that they're a state. So it's ISIS. If you see, okay, some of the oil fields of northern Iraq are battleground. The Syrian fields, but we had already banned them from the market because of the government. So is this having a major impact? It has a major impact on all the private investors that had just made all these final investment decisions on stuff in Kurdistan, which was booming like never before. So they hurt. Turkey probably hurts because most of that oil was being sent to Turkey. But for the rest, for the world market, this is really small stuff. Yeah? Even if it's being traded. They use the old channels that were already used for illegal trade under Assad. So I think when it comes to the oil market, we shouldn't be too worried unless ISIS manages to take Baghdad and go to the south. Then we have a problem. Okay, if you look at demand, that's really interesting. I mentioned China, so that's old news. But what people forget is that one of the major suppliers of world markets is still the Middle East. And their demand for energy is booming. They've had the Arab Spring. They need to fix their economies. They have so many young people. I wouldn't want to be a prime minister of a country like that, because you know there's only one thing you have to do, is create meaningful jobs so your citizens can have meaningful lives. And we're talking about societies with more than 50% of the kids younger than 25. Yeah? That's a lot of jobs. You need an awful lot of energy income if you want to stimulate the economy like that. And then with all the unrest. So at the moment, since a lot of the energy is also subsidized for its citizens, demand is going through the roof. And if they don't want to invest in capacity expansion, it has, and you want to export as much as you can because that's where you make your money, then you have to become more energy efficient. And that's what they're working on. I have more discussions about solar and wind in Saudi Arabia than I have here. Can you believe that? Because they want to keep on exporting their oil, and they want to make a transition in their own energy economy. Stop burning the crude oil in the summer for cooling purposes. Yeah? And they need to, otherwise they need to expand their production capacity to 20 million barrels a day. It's going to cost them a ton, and success is not guaranteed. They have to do this now. Yeah? Because the kids, every year, they will be older, and you can only send them to university for so long. Yeah? Now, some they can convince to stay away until they finish the PhD, and no, we don't care at all that you have a delay of 1 or 2 years. Yeah? Your job is not ready for you yet. Yeah? But at some point, they will want to come back and lead these meaningful lives. Yeah? We know from the time of Nasser in Egypt, when they created a lot of unmeaningful jobs, that people became really restless and they had a lot of social problems. They know that. And they don't want that to happen in these countries. They want to create an economy that works. But it's very difficult. And we see demand in the OECD nicely going down, you know, stagnating, going down. And of course, when it comes to traditional energy, we're also replacing some. No, this one you just... So this is a story that hits your newspapers all the time. Prices have gone down since June, 25%. I put both of them, Brent and WTI, because it's important. Now the difference is not so big, but a year ago it was nearly $20 difference. American prices being lower than the rest of the world. Why? Because the Americans were producing so much oil that they couldn't carry it through their infrastructures. They don't have enough pipelines. They can't build the Keystone XL. So they're basically training by train, sending all this oil to the centers, because where their refining places are in the south is not where the new oil is found. So there's a mismatch in where everything is going on. So there was huge discounts for anyone who wanted to take it in, for instance, in the Midwest. Refineries were having they had the best time of their life, because if they would take it very close to where it was produced in North Dakota, and it didn't have to be trained to Houston or to Boston or New York, they would get even bigger discounts. Yeah? And of course then with your refinery margin, you could sell the gasoline for the same price. Oh, those people are making the lists grow. So we've seen this decline, so now you know that. Yeah, there's a difference. So the question is, and I tried to raise it before, where is this price going to go? Well, this is my pain threshold. Yeah? This is the price. You see all sorts of countries there. In the dark, you see the production cost of the oil. And the majors are, on average, depending on their portfolio, around $40, $50 a barrel. They still have some cheap oil in their portfolio, and then they have really expensive oil, the technical oil. And then you have the OPEC countries who in general have very cheap oil, but they need a certain price because their expenditure level is so high that they need a price of $50, $60, or $80 in order not to change their policies. So that's the price they need in order to keep going with what they're doing. And so we already know that Russia, Iran, and Venezuela, talking about agent theories, why is it that those three are now all of a sudden falling on this side of the line where the prices are, and the rest of them, it seems to rest around 80. Yeah? So all these other guys can get by. Your technical oil, except maybe some parts of the Arctic, will stay in your mix. You won't have to close your investments. And that's where your price is. And the big question is, if Saudi Arabia wants to arrest some of that growth in North America, it's possible, because the United States, the way the shale developments are financed, are flex workers of the world. They don't make a return. You see the one drilling, you drill one pad and you finance it from selling the oil from the previous one. So all of a sudden there is no money, you stop drilling. It's as simple as that. Your bank will say, nah. Yeah? It goes, nah, and then the drilling stops. So it's very flexible. The question is, and of course that's what Saudi Arabia is banking on to some degree, that some of the space that needs to be made for OPEC crude will be because the Americans will shrink a little bit. But if you look at the productivity, actually, when it stays at $80, the Americans are, okay, their margin will shrink. But they can continue doing the stuff, what they're doing, even at $80. When it gets to 60, maybe some guys will get in trouble because some of the companies have very heavy debts and need to service their loans. But will Saudi Arabia be able to sustain a price of $60? Saudi Arabia has enough monetary reserves, so this country, I think, could do it. Can dip in its reserves and do it. But is it prepared to pick a fight with all the other ones who don't have the reserves? The Iranians will go crazy, yeah, if that happens. Russia's not part of OPEC, so they just have to pray that something comes out this month from the meeting. But I think this pain threshold, what sort of change countries are willing to sustain, is really interesting. So maybe we do have kind of a price band in the market. Yeah? And I think if the political stability of OPEC country counts more, then I'm nearly done with the oil part. I'll come back next year for the gas part, right? Huh?
Perhaps you can come to a conclusion.
Yeah, no, it's so this is going to be really interesting, yeah? And this is all about energy relationships, yeah? Energy relationships in how strong is OPEC as a group? Are they willing to share the cost? Are they willing to share the pain of lower prices? Who's better prepared to go for a market share type of strategy? Who finds it important enough to try and push the Americans a little bit back in the market? How important is that? Who can change the economy? Who can reduce expenditure enough? Where's the flexibility? Really interesting. Because their only market at the time is not us anymore. They don't sell anything to us anymore. Yeah, a little bit, yeah? Not much. It's China, where most of this oil is flowing to now. So if China sneezes, these guys have a severe cold. Okay, this is the last one. I was going to show you how reliant Russia was, if the federal income of Russia was on oil rather than gas. So 12% of the federal income of Russia is gas income, and 88% of Russian energy income is from oil, and 50% of its federal income is energy in total. So it's quite a substantial bit. Just kind of to get the discussion going, yeah? And then we stop here, and you will get the other slides too, and I promise you, if you want to hear the gas story, we'll do that next year, okay?
Thank you very much, Coby, for some technical.
There's a lot more gas than there's oil.
For us. That's good. Put you in the spotlight as well.
Okay.
Before I open the floor, I've just one question to start off. You talk about developments in the oil and in the background gas markets in relation to geopolitical tensions. But what is the relation? So I see that, of course, when there is trouble in the Middle East, it has an impact on exports, etc. But what is the relation in terms of causality? Is there a linkage between these resources and the kind of tensions that we see?
Well, I think the direct relationship is the fact that our economy will either grow less or more, yeah? Which again is a social thing, because then the government has to divide, has to either shrink its expenditure or not. Or we will spend more on driving around than we like. I mean, today I was pleasantly surprised when I filled up my car coming here. I thought, wow, this is the cheapest ride I had to Groningen for a long time. You do notice these things, and that's just 20 euros I kept in my pocket. I thought, ooh, it's turning out to be a very nice day this way. Because you cannot, my grandmother always said you can only spend it once. Yeah? And so when wages are under great pressure, this sort of thing, I mean, if you listen to our tax discussion at the moment in this country, they're nearly killing themselves in Parliament over 20 euros. Yeah? And you've just been given the 20 euros in your pocket because of a change in oil prices. Yeah? So it's the economy is still reflected. Yeah? In Asia, oil and gas prices are linked. Here in this part of Europe, they have become de-linked since 2008. We now have gas-to-gas competition, but more or less, it works, but Russia is a really important supplier on that market. Yeah, so if we do gas next time, we can discuss how far Russia is a price setter rather than. And then in politics, if oil or gas or uranium or you name it becomes very concentrated, then you want to make sure that these countries understand they need to produce sufficient quantities to keep the rest of the world happy. If they don't, then you go get it. That's basically how simple it is. Yeah? So China feels uncertain because of discussion about climate change and because of the air quality in the country. They know they cannot continue with the current energy policy they have now because they suffocate themselves, and social unrest and the cost of production in big cities is going up because no expatriate wants to live there, but also not affluent Chinese want to live in their big cities anymore. And then you have a problem, similar to what we had when we had smoke-related problems. So China needs to solve that, and to solve that it needs to get oil and gas. It does have shale potential, so it might actually be able to produce it themselves. But in the meantime, as long as they haven't conquered that technology and have been able to prove to do it at a competitive level, they need to go get the oil and gas somewhere else, and they want to be big players around the table. So they're joining in Angola, in Africa. First they just had contracts in all the countries that no one else wanted to invest in. Yeah? Sudan, that's a great success story, that one, from an investor's perspective. Huh? So China is evolving. It has built up this big portfolio, but also now it has a stake in not being cut off because regional problems and groups or competing bands are going over your property and destroying it, and you can't have all that. So that's when we start talking security, and we might intervene because all of a sudden we find a reason. We never say it that way, that our economic interests are at stake, but then we will find some human right that needs defending, and we go in. Yeah. Simple.
That's a very clear point of view. I turn to the audience.
I'm old and cynical. That's what
yes. Well, we still have a story waiting for us. A comment on Russia. Perhaps someone else first. So we keep the cliffhanger going on. I walk to the other end of the room.
Well, I have a great map of Ukraine and Russia, so maybe as a part of a question we can go there. Yeah, I'll look it up.
Okay, we'll come to that.
We'll come to that.
Do you expect that the southern pipelines, Russia is mostly working with their gas to Europe and now with the southern pipeline? Do you expect that's going to get through?
Oh, you mean the South Stream?
The South Stream, yeah, and perhaps include also the new contracts with China for building pipelines in that direction.
Oh yeah, no, I mean the contracts with China are really clear. I mean they are going to build a gas pipeline, they're also going to extend the pipelines for oil, but they want them all the way to Vladivostok because they don't want to make the same mistake as they had with Europe, where they became a captive producer. They want to be able to arbitrate between the European and the Chinese market. And they want to have an outlet at sea with, where they can export to the rest of the world. So Kuzmo will go to Vladivostok so that some of that supply might actually end up through a naval route in China again, but then the Chinese will have to purchase it in the international market and not in the pipeline. And pipelines are a particular problem also for Russia because the value of your resource is realized in the market. And if you can't reach the market because either you meet Europeans who don't want your stuff, or you have a transit country that takes your stuff, or you have a country like China who negotiated you until you saw blue in the face and gave in because you had geopolitical problems on the other end, you don't feel very comfortable that you're getting the best price for your goods, right? So Russia is, if it feels boxed in, they do have some reason to think that because they're being, kind of nudged around from two sides. When it comes to the pipelines to Europe, I think Italy Yeah? Italy is an investor in South Stream and has great interest in bringing that pipeline because for them it is diversity of supply because they don't want to be depending on the route through the Ukraine where there's difficulties. They don't want to rely just on Algerian gas, which is the other big supplier, or Libyan gas. The Egyptians, who have been sending gas to Greece, have already, they had an accident with the pipeline and they can't find the spare parts, so they're already not exporting anymore for good reasons, because Egypt had great social economic problems, and with gas you can actually create a very modern industry. And if you do the right thing, you use that gas for Egyptian development. But that also implies that Greece will have to find a new source. Turkey is now developing in a great gas hub. Yeah? We all thought they would collect gas from Iraq, which is a byproduct of their oil production. I heard a commissioner or someone from the EU say to a poor Iraqi who only has 4 hours of power supply a day, you must export to Europe. I thought, must. Only after you have 24/7 power in Iraq, I think, but you know, that's just me. And so alternative Russian supplies are not really such a crazy idea for Southern Europe. So I do think, and also for the Balkans, in all our discussions since February, have we once shed one word on how the Balkan countries feel that we stopped discussing South Stream, which was their savior. Yeah? They were finally getting clean fuel at a reasonable price. And we told them, nah. Yeah? So there's more to it, to these discussions. So yes, I think in the end South Stream will be built, but the route might change. Yeah? There's already discussion because we have Blue Stream going to Turkey, and it's quite possible that they make South Stream go through Turkey as well. And then all of a sudden, the negotiations with Europe become really interesting because then we have to deal with Turkey. And Turkey, I'm sure, is interested because Turkey is always interested to be on the, you know.
Very good. Other questions? Yes.
As far as I know, can you go back to that previous map? Because just before the troubles in Syria started, there was a trilateral agreement between Iran, Iraq and Syria to build a pipeline, gas pipeline, to connect Iranian gas to the Mediterranean. And of course the Qataris were not at all happy with that idea, as far as I know.
I'm sure they were not too concerned.
No, oh, okay, maybe not. But anyway, we got a problem now in Syria, in which the Qataris are actually funding, according to Joe Biden, a part of the insurgencies. So I find that an interesting potential example of the geopolitics of energy, in which some wars might be the results of some plans.
Well, listen, we know what the impact of Iran is on some of the countries because they have been having relationships with some of the governments or groups for a very, very long time. That's no news. That we don't like it, that's also no news. Yeah? So I don't find that very surprising. The pipeline, there is a pipeline between Iran and Turkey. There's actually a contract on which half the time Iran can't deliver because it needs all the gas for its own economy. So it was supposed to deliver gas to Turkey, and they ended up buying Russian gas. There's even, you see that dotted line, there was even plans, the Egyptians at some point were so optimistic about how much gas they could produce that they were going to export it to Nabucco. I mean, now it doesn't even reach Sinai. Yeah? So, so that the pipeline is there. Yes, you could source more because Iran has great potential for conventional gas. It's a little bit far away, so it's a lot of kilometers of pipeline. There's also a great market for Iranian gas in Pakistan and India, potentially. There's only 10 kilometers of pipeline missing to link them up. Yeah? But because Pakistan and India cannot agree on anything, it's not going to be put in. So the 10 kilometers are not going to be built. Yeah? This is it's already there. So Iran can just, it's 10 kilometers, it's a week of work, and that market could be accessed. But India refuses to buy gas that goes through Pakistan, because then you get transit problems just similar to the ones with Ukraine. On the conference where we both were, the Chinese, why were the Chinese so happy with the Russian gas deal? Explicitly, I mean, this was a guy from an institute as part of the foreign ministry said, well, and we don't have a transit country in between. I thought, well, sure, you're in Berlin, rub it in, yeah? But for them, it was really important, yeah? Because they could have gone through Mongolia, which would have been a shorter route, but they're going around it, yeah? So there is something to it, because whichever way you put it, Ukraine had a lot, or has a lot of nuisance power. And you have to understand how it works. The European companies, they have supply contracts with Gazprom, the Russian company. And Gazprom then has to ship it to the European Union border because of the way we liberalized our market. We take possession of the gas at the border. And so we make the Russians responsible to ship it to our borders. And we were really happy because, of course, we've seen for the past 20 years this was not ideal, yeah? And that a lot of Russian money was left on the table, yeah? But, since that was part of our contracts, we didn't get too bothered until, of course, in 2004 and 2009 there was problems. Now it's been reversed. The whole credit risk of these contracts is now put in our lap, yeah? I mean, before the end of the year, we're going to guarantee 3.1 billion in arrears, yeah? This is gas that has been consumed last year by the Ukraine. And we have to cough up another 1.2 billion to make sure that they can purchase the January and February gas. Yeah? So all of a sudden, the credit risk that we had put in Russia all the time, all these years, is now coming to us. And now we're saying, oh, that's an awful lot of money. Yeah? But the Russians have been saying for a long time that the relationship is really expensive with Ukraine, because if you consume the gas, yeah, you need to pay it at some point, yeah? Can you imagine a situation where the German off-takers of here, the Groningen gas, here GasUnie has a great building in this city, and that after a month, the CEO reports that the German off-takers have not paid? What do you think will happen with them? Yeah? We're talking about here a year, yeah? That bills were not paid. And then we call it, and when it's being turned off, then we say, oh, that's a geopolitical deed. Yeah? But if it was turned off here in Groningen, they would go into the control room and said, no more gas to Germany, then that would just be we would be very Dutch commercial sense. Yeah? We have to watch our own talk. Huh? We can't just talk one way out of our mouth when we're talking for this person, and when it's that part of the contract, all of a sudden we talk that way. We have to stay analytically sharp, because we're fooling ourselves in this conflict. Yeah?
About fooling ourselves, there is one aspect in the question related to this non-existing state,
ISIS.
ISIS, sorry, which seems to finance itself from selling oil. And
Qatar is gas.
Qatar is gas. It surprises me a bit. Like the audience, I'm dependent here on what I find in the media.
So am I. I don't know.
Yeah, but when the Russians do something, the first thing that comes to mind is economic sanctions. And so can't we sanction those who buy it? So to whom do they sell? And are they not known? You talk about illegal markets in Syria.
Who's they?
IS is selling.
Oh, yeah.
And they get money for it. So who is buying it?
Assad.
And why? And Assad is buying it.
Assad is buying it so they can shoot at each other with the same machinery.
Oh,
it's almost like the First World War.
No,
the Dutch were selling stuff to the English and to the Germans, and we got rich and they got dead.
Well, that has a long history. We did that during the 80 years war as well.
No, most of the oil is traded locally.
Okay.
So, or maybe
so,
all
but
of it.
it's local trade, and that's enough money to keep that operation running.
Well, if you are engaged in a armed conflict, that's usually fairly energy intense, and since you're mobile, it means that oil is your product of choice, because oil is a mobile fuel. Gas is a more stationary fuel, although LNG can make you is a different technology, but that would be they can't use it there. So if they want to stay mobile and do what they're doing, they need oil. So they're willing to pay a price. And I don't know how their pockets are being lined. It could be from the sales. So what I said, they used the old network that was developed under Saddam Hussein when they were also under sanctions of the United Nations. This whole network of illegal oil trade was developed. It's always been there, and it's not that difficult. They even use incredibly low-tech technologies to convert the crude oil into oil products. So they have diesel and gasoline. They do that in, you burn it, you basically heat it up, you burn it a bit, and then you separate the fuel. That's what's being done.
Okay. I see many questions. No, a few only, but an important one for sure.
Thank you. I had a question about a continent which was not so much mentioned yet. I'm not quite sure if you have that much focus on that in your work, but I was wondering if you have any opinion on if there's anything going on with the African continent and what might happen there in the future. And one reason why I'm asking particularly is because the UN is increasingly developing this debate on energy poverty and making sure that everybody gets access to energy as a basic element of development. And it's really getting shape now, and resources are being diverted, I guess. The question is, do you have any opinion on the role of Africa in this debate?
Now, Africa is booming. There's offshore Mozambique, and mostly Mozambique, but some Tanzania, gas has been found. These countries are somewhat puzzled how to handle this because they don't have knowledge to negotiate with IOCs who take up the best consultants. Yeah, they take their best consultants, and then these countries have to negotiate contracts. So they still are debating. Obviously, for an investor, the best way to develop these projects, just like in Angola, is for international markets, because if you sell your gas or oil on the Mozambican market, you get government-controlled prices, so that doesn't really help you with giving you a good return on money. But from a development perspective, and also to some extent the gas industry actually realizes that if you can show the gas brings development, so that they have more reliable power, they can start light industries, that actually helps the license to operate for the gas companies. So there is debate about how much of that gas will actually end up in local economies so that they can develop, both in Tanzania and also Mozambique. South Africa has shale, but it's in a nature resort. I mean, I'm sure you all read about that in the paper. Shell is doing some studies there, whether it can be done. Because South Africa is coal country, so if they want to grow, usually coal is only, you can only use it for power. But if you want molecules, you need something else, and if you don't want to import, so their gas could actually be also a way of releasing a lot of people out of poverty. If you could translate that gas into light industries, so you could create jobs. We've done a project, for instance, in Bolivia, who has huge amounts of gas, but no gas exports because of all sorts of historical and political problems with its neighbors. But there, people were at some point, development programs brought water to the Altiplano. But if it's cold, if it's cold water, if you can bring hot water into these homes, they can begin baking bread. The productivity of what people can do, earning only $1 a day is tremendous when you begin to translate that. And I think if you look at Angola, the same thing. I mean, the developments is like maybe almost too much, that they have to really watch it not to fall in the trap of Dutch disease, that inflation is going up. But so far, for some of the African countries, it's been a delight. Ghana is still to follow. Nigeria is just a very bad example, where a lot of money was made, but it was just never translated into this type of development you would have liked to have seen with that sort of money. So yeah, I think, and Kenya, of course, is quite jealous So they're hoping, really hoping that the basin actually extend to their shores as well. So they have some, but you know, the fact that in Tanzania they already found a lot less, you know, I wouldn't. I think their onshore is a little bit more promising.
Okay, a last round of questions, and I think
now we're getting Russia. Finally,
I think we return to Ukraine somehow. Here you are.
Let me stand up to this because I was inaudible. Yeah. Thank you for your talk. I loved it, and I think a lot of us really did. So please come back.
Well,
Russia.
I belong to you, so I mean, I don't understand what the problem is. Yeah.
Well, next time we'll chip in for the train ticket. Maybe that's not get away from the molecules.
A canister of diesel will do it.
Okay, the Russian question. I was in Hungary and Romania recently, and they said to me, Age, all the bad things come from the east. And of course you start asking questions. Why do all the bad things come from the east? Well, first of course they named the weather and a few other things, but of course then Russia and energy politics. I love your thesis that energy is a social economic construct, and if I follow you correctly and if I listen attentively, you put forth that the social economic dimension basically sets the stage for the politics, if I understand. Yeah. How then, and please enlighten me on this item, how then is the Russian situation at this moment, the crisis over Ukraine, from Russia's perspective and the EU perspective, has mostly to do with our understanding and our view of how we see and how we understand this crisis in development. Because that's what I get, that Russia is being depicted maybe in the media and other fora as being aggressive, or they are using it as a geopolitical weapon. Please enlighten me on this.
Well, I think in the core, this whole problem is not an energy problem. We're just using energy as a tool, just like maybe Russia does it, and we do it as well. We talked, I mean, I saw in my newspaper, it says, oh, we should go on a buyer strike. Yeah, that was like 2 days after Yanukovych hadn't even unpacked his suitcases yet. So I think energy has nothing to do with it. This is a problem of Russia being afraid that NATO would expand and the Crimea would become part of NATO, that they would lose their base in the Black Sea. This is also part of because whichever way we look at it, in the Ukraine, it has been it's a very weak state. Its institutions are very weak. Corruption was very high, which was really bad for Ukrainians in the first place. Yeah, and I really fear that the Ukrainian government in Kiev has not purchased enough gas to make sure that its old people will be warm enough. Yeah, I'm really concerned. They're playing politics with their own people. Yeah, and then when you're in the east, you don't expect any gas at all. Yeah, it wasn't purchased for you. But this whole problem was about. I think in the end, we've been deluded by the fact that when the Soviet Union fell apart and comical countries went their own way, it was a very peaceful divorce. I'm a political scientist, and countries falling apart was my #1 political risk. That was the worst that could happen. And they said, if you ever go and work for a commercial company, you're going to do political risk, this is what you have to, this is terrible, you know. We don't even know what's going to happen. Yeah? And it happened, and for some reason, for a long time, it seemed that it was fairly peaceful, at least from our perspective. Have we really looked close enough whether it was so peaceful and good for the ones who went through it? Yeah? I'm not so sure. If you look at what happened to the Yeltsin years with the economy, Russians lost their entire savings 2 or 3 times over. In 1998, when oil prices were at their low, that I thought, finally, I'm going to live through when the minimum prices of the IEA are going to be enacted. I hoped so much for a price below $8 a barrel, just for one day, see if they had the guts to do it. Yeah? That, for Russia, that time was just terrible. And they were lucky. And it was just a coincidence when Putin came that OPEC finally found itself and imposed its production strategy, and they began to make a little bit of money again. It was really horrible in that country, terrible. Yeah? Nothing worked, no pensions. Universities literally falling apart, and they really have nice universities. I mean, there you can study African philosophy, Asian philosophy. They still all have that. You know, we lost that already even before I moved into university. Yeah? That was already part of the economy drive. Yeah? But they still had that. So there was really gems in their institutions, and they were trying to hang on to it. And it was just, you know, by 2000, quite a lot of it was gone. And then oil prices began to increase. They benefited from the Iraqi crisis, yeah. And then we think it was and then politically they began to centralize, because the way things were organized with the oligarchs, and companies were sold below their real value, and the voucher program. Politically, people were really unhappy with the fact that this had all happened. So whether it was Putin or some leader after him, someone was going to pay the price for the fact that they felt stolen. They were talking all the time about windfall profits. And I remember I was in Moscow in 2003 when this discussion was going on, and ExxonMobil came into town thinking about, you know, perhaps buying a quarter of UCOS. That the talk in the street was, is Putin going to take his share or not? Yeah? They really thought, given how the previous 10 to 15 years had been going, they wouldn't have blamed him, I think, really, if he had ran with the money and gone, because that's what everyone else had done before him. But he didn't, you know, and that earned respect. That was politically was a really clever move of him. Yeah? And so we have to understand the chaos that Russia was in, trying all sorts of experimental economic theories on its people, and they were struggling. And this is a country in winter, it's like really unpleasant when you have to struggle. Yeah? And I think we have underestimated also how hurt they were in their pride. And that I think with Ukraine, during the last crisis with Yanukovych not paying, at some point, you know, also your pride is in the mix. Yeah, you say, oh well, you guys should contemplate paying us one day, and then it doesn't happen. At some point, you know, people get really ticked off, and I think we've underestimated how sour the Russians have become, because I know in the discussions about the EU 2050 agenda. Basically, Europe was saying, well, you know, you guys need to invest in Yamal because we need it until 2030. And then, you know what? Piss off with your oil and gas, because then we have solar and wind. And then I think, you know, that's not... And you expect Russia to commit more than $100 billion in investments so that we can drive the car, and then we don't want to give them the guarantee of a market saying you will have access to our consumers? Yeah? Gazprom clauses. So I think we're not as innocent as we seemed. We have done a lot of stuff where we were snotty about our relationship with Russia, and now they're irritated by us. And we are irritated with them because they've been doing stuff in terms of political freedoms. Is this about energy? No. I really think that energy is just something that's getting dragged by the hairs, and it's convenient. You know, we all understand the language. We use oil or gas weapon, and then, you know, a nice article in a newspaper. Tomorrow is another day. Yeah.
On that note, Coby, I think it's time to thank you for a wonderful evening.
Going on the road. Huh?
Exactly, because, well, we are tempted to ask you back next week, because we have the third lecture in this series, unfortunately, has been cancelled.
I'm in Saudi Arabia.
You're in Saudi Arabia. Perhaps we can have an internet connection then with Skype or something like that. And in 2 weeks we will continue with this series. I think I've you have taken us on a highly informative tour in a very interesting field of
I
study.
have to apologize, yeah, because I mean, this is a pent-up story, as they say. I've been wanting to do this story for such a long time that I try to do too much in too little time. So I'm really sorry, because it's my fault that we didn't get to the structured gas
We didn't
story.
get to the gas, but
No,
we did.
I really feel sorry.
We learned a lot about oil, and I think you also proved that you're not only an international expert, but you also showed that you're our expert because you're here in Groningen. And on behalf of Studium Generale, I'd like to thank you for this with a book with an apt title. It's called War.
Dankjewel.
Thank you for coming, and see you in 2 weeks.